and welcome to the Alexander Hamilton Society's debate on defining the United States' role in the world. And just so we can dive right into it, I'll begin by introducing our speakers. All the way on your left is Mr. Roger Zahkheim. He's the director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. He was named by Foreign Policy magazine as one of the top Republicans in foreign policy, and he has served on the congressionally appointed commissioner of the Commission on the National Defense Strategy of the United States, and was a co-chair of Covington and Burlington Public Policy and Government Affairs Practice. His past experience also includes serving as the General Counsel and Deputy Staff Director on the United States Armed Services Committee. In that role, Mr. Zakheim managed to pass the annual National Defense Authorization Act. The NDAA is the annual defense policy bill, which authorizes the Defense Department's $600, $700 billion, or whatever they decide on, budget.
We're going for 700.
Mr. Zakheim also served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense under George W. Bush, where he managed the department's policies and programs related to Iraq and Afghanistan coalition efforts. All the way on your right is Dr. James Goldgeier, who is a visiting senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and professor of international relations at the School of International Service here at AU. He was dean from 2011 of SIS, and he currently holds the 2018-2019 Library of Congress U.S.-Russia Chair at the John W. Klug Center. Previously, he was a professor at GW and has taught at Cornell University as well. He served as director for Russian, Ukrainian, and Eurasian affairs in the Security Council of President Bill Clinton, and has held a number of policy appointments, including as Henry Kissinger Chair at the Library of Congress and Edward Teller National Foundation at the Hoover Institution, along with appointments at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, Brookings Institution, and the Center for International Security and Cooperation. Our moderator in the center is Dr. Shoon Murray, who is a professor here at American University and SIS, and writes about the American foreign policy and the political process. Her most recent books are the Terror Authorization, The History and Politics of the 2001 AUMF and Mission Creep, the Militarization of U.S. Foreign Policy. She has written about the use of war powers and counterterrorism, the relationship between U.S. ambassadors and the regional combatant commanders, U.S. adjustment to global power shifts and diffusion, public reactions to military force, and the rally round the flag phenomenon, and the role of values and partisanship in American leaders' belief in political systems. She has earned her PhD in political science from Yale. Dr. Murray, you have the floor.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thanks very much, Kevin Norton and Alexander Hamilton Society for organizing this. It seems like a broad question to ask what the U.S. role in the world is. It is a broad question, but it's a timely one, just in the current context of having a president with a philosophy and orientation that challenges a lot of precepts of past presidents and past traditions. And in a context also in which you have a renewal of some sort of great power rivalries, it's an important question to ask. So without further ado, you're not here to listen to me. We will start the debate. The format will be, we will have 10 minutes per speaker. Roger will start, then Jim, and then we'll have 5 minutes where they can, I'm hoping they disagree, they can clarify or rebut the other side. Then I'll ask questions, a few questions, just upon the pump, and then we'll go out to you. So think about your questions as our speakers are debating. So why don't we begin?
Well, thank you, and thanks to AHS for putting this together, and to all of you for taking time out of your busy schedule to think about what I am passionate about, what we're passionate about. It's a very important topic, and so hopefully this will accompany you very well. It's an enjoyable hour or so. So I'm going to take 10 minutes to talk about America's role in the world, which is hugely important. It is something that is being challenged, as was just referenced, by our president and many of his advisors. And I'm a Republican, and I'm someone who has served in Republican administrations, Republican Congresses. I'm a proud partisan, and yet some of what I'll outline tonight perhaps may not align with where President Trump is, and perhaps where Democrats are. So that is really a long-winded way of saying this is all up in the air. And defining America's role in the world because of the politics and the partisanship in Washington today, as well as was referenced, the really dynamic, changing international security environment necessitates these types of conversations, these types of debates, defining, kind of going back to core principles as to what we are as a nation, what we're seeking to do. So I'm going to hit on three principles here. Going to unpack them a little bit for you. I'm going to shamelessly kind of promote the organization which I lead, which is the Ronald Reagan Institute, the 40th President of the United States, who I believe, as a conservative, actually represents not only a foreign policy that worked in the 80s, in terms of resulting in the end of the Cold War, but also probably has much to teach us, not probably, does have a lot to teach us in terms of what our foreign policy ought to look like today. That may be controversial, we may debate over that, but I definitely want you to think about that. And then I'll conclude with really the main area in which I think I depart from the camp within the conservative movement, with the so-called isolationist movement, where they like to refer to themselves as the restraint movement, and maybe we'll get into that in the Q&A. So to me, the way to approach the question of what is America's role in the world really gets at what do we want to do as a nation, who do we want to be as a nation, more importantly, how can government, in particular, carry out its responsibilities towards its people, the citizenry. And to me, that breaks down to three very simple principles. The first is our role in the world should be governed by security. Okay? Maintaining our sovereignty, the ability for all of us to live in peace. Okay, so our engagement in the world needs to, at the very least, do whatever is necessary to maintain security. The second area of focus is what do we need to do to maintain prosperity? Okay, we all enjoy our life here in this country, hope, the opportunities we have, the economic security that we've been given, we'd like to provide for ourselves and our family. All that falls into, for me, the category of prosperity. Our engagement in the world really should be guided by what do we need to do to maintain that prosperity. Unfortunately, at least since the Second World War, we have been a prosperous nation, and we ought to employ policies globally that ensure that prosperity. The third, and this one is a little bit more, I guess, debated and it needs to be defined, and there are different kind of factors and how you approach it. Everyone want to guess what the third one is? I'm talking about Reagan here. Freedom? Boom! Who said that? My man. Freedom. All right? Freedom is the other component, the other principle which really should guide what America's role in the world should be. And to me, all three of these reflect not only something that is utilitarian, the standpoint of, yes, we need to be safe because we want to take care of ourselves and our family, our friends, our communities. We want to be prosperous because, so we just want to be able to do the things we want to do and lead the life we want to live. But I would argue that these are also kind of moral imperatives. It is a moral imperative for government to keep us secure, for government to allow us to at least give everybody the opportunity to prosper. And of course, the third one that I'd like to pursue is that there's a moral imperative for this country to promote and pursue freedom. All right? Now, not only do I think those are morally sound approaches in terms of governing our role in the world, but I also believe that those three principles are rooted in our founding. All right? Now, it's probably obvious any country needs to be rooted in security. You want a government to make sure that everybody can be prosperous. But also, I think our country, going back to our founding documents, believes in freedom. Freedom is something that we should give our citizenry and something that we should promote to people around the world. Freedom not only is an end in its own, but I think it, in my view, and I think more importantly, in terms of our experience, particularly in the way that Ronald Reagan espoused it, freedom is something that complements the objective in terms of being prosperous, and it complements the security that we all seek. Historically as well, we've done this. We have engaged in the world to make ourselves more secure. We've engaged in the world to be more prosperous, and we've engaged in the world to advance the cause of freedom. That is not something that is being invented here right now as I speak to you, but something that is rooted in practice in this country for years over years, decades over decades since our founding. Let's start with the first. And the essence of security is one that, I'll get back to the end, is one that Reagan said, we maintain the peace through our strength. Weakness only invites aggression. Right? That notion that we have to have a strong, robust military apparatus, security apparatus, and one that presents itself and deploys itself globally, to me, is in the 21st century, and has been true since the Second World War, is a necessary condition for security. We will not be able to maintain our security interests, or we risk doing ourselves harm if we seek to only maintain our security interests through ICE and border security. And I'll get back to that. How am I doing on time? I think I got about 4 more minutes. Is that good? Anybody keeping count? Good. No one's keeping count. I'm going to keep on going. The other element, objection. I'm going to keep going until I see you're clearly disagreeing with me. So far, I don't know if I've succeeded. The other piece of security here, which is key for security, is, and this really kind of translates into how we need to present ourselves globally, engage in the world, is we are better off when we have alliances, when we have allies, we have friends, we have partners. Not only for people we can go to war with when we're trying to stop a Nazi Germany, or maybe so bold, a Taliban, but also in order to advance the prosperity which I've described, and to advance the freedom I've described. And more times than not, we will not be able to work with others if they don't share our values in terms of our political values, our economic system, and our political system. Much harder to get that done. We're stronger with alliances, and particularly now, as was referenced before, great power competition dealing with the challenges posed by China or Russia. In the absence of allies, in the absence of friends, we won't succeed. Now, how we treat our friends, and the particular tactics we employ, here I don't think Trump is all wrong. I think you need to have honest relationships and speak frankly with people that you work with. And if you feel like you're being taken advantage of, those are generally not good friendships, or friendships that won't last. So, to me, it's not, alliances and friendships and coalitions don't work if we're papering over differences and problems. On the prosperity side, I won't spend too long on this, but the essence of what I want to say is that we have a rules-based international order, and the professors to my left lecture on this, they can explain to this, but as a practitioner, my point of view is this, is that countries that have market systems, that believe in free trade and have systems that support it, are generally complementary to what we are seeking to do with our own economy. And to the extent the world is not oriented towards Western economic system, that world will be less hospitable to us, and as a result, we'll be less prosperous. Free trade goes right in the heart of what I'm talking about here. And to the extent that we go down the road of being protectionist, to the extent we go down the road either of Elizabeth Warren or Trump's, in my view, worse instincts on trade, the more hostile the world will be towards us, and the less prosperous we will be. Reagan was somebody who came to office on a populist way, but he never, ever defended or promoted tariffs and kind of working into a system here. And so to me, the key to prosperity is not only security alliances that are security alliances like NATO, but also multilateral systems like WTO and free trade agreements. Now, the undercurrent there is multilateral systems like that, to me, are only useful to the extent they advance our interest of prosperity, our interest of security. They're not an end in its own. It's an end towards our interests. Last point, the freedom point, the one I want to harp on just for a minute. And here I'll just read a Reagan quote because, again, I'm shamelessly self-promoting my entity here. But Ronald Reagan said that he believes in renewed strength of the democratic movement. He's talking about the 1980s. We're in the Cold War and fighting the competition against the Soviet Union. But he said that a global campaign for freedom will strengthen the prospects of arms control, which of course is a big issue of his day, dealing with the Soviet nuclear threat, but also world peace. When you think about China today, and what President Xi is up to, who's now lifetime president of China, he believes he has a system that is superior to our system. He believes that people, not just in China, but around the world, will trade their freedom in exchange for two things: security and prosperity. Sound familiar? Two or three that I was harping on. He doesn't think people will need freedom, will want freedom, will pursue freedom, they believe it's a natural right. Unless we are promoting freedom globally, we will lose that competition with the China. And you will see countries in Asia and in Africa, and I'm just talking about the next 2, 3, 4 decades, move away from democratic system of government, move away from Western economies, move in the direction of a Xi Chinese system that ultimately will isolate us and risk the prosperity and security and the freedoms that we all cherish. We can talk more about that in the constant debate, but I'll wrap up here. That, there is a view that because of the mistakes in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and trillions of dollars spent and lives lost, that the freedom agenda has no place. That there is no, that if somebody who seeks to promote freedom-loving people around the world, that somehow you're an imperialist, occupationist who wants to put forward 100,000 troops on the ground and just impose our will on people with no interest in our values. To me, that is a characterization that this president, but also the previous president, has imposed to basically say, let's go ahead and focus on domestic policy. No, I think it's a huge mistake. On the Republican side, it's now being manifest in this notion of, as I referenced before, isolationism, this idea of restraint, this notion that if we only build our walls a little bit higher, and I'm not talking about immigration here, I'm talking about a worldview, then we would somehow be safer and more prosperous. I reject that outright. Now, I'll end with a Reagan quote here as well. He said, and he's reflecting somebody who went through the Great Depression, Second World War, those were the animating moments of his life that impacted his worldview. He said, we've learned that isolationism never was and never will be an acceptable response to tyrannical governments with an expansionist intent. And I would argue that the Russia we see today and the China that we will continue to see will look more like expansionist governments of the past than something different that others may wish they're seeing today. And there.
Thank you.
I agree. I do. So great remarks, and I have. I never thought I'm not going to quote Reagan, but I have quoted Ronald Reagan a lot since January of 2017. I never imagined that I would spend so much time quoting.
Nancy Pelosi.
Quoting Ronald Reagan. Yeah. So I'm gonna come at it from a slightly different standpoint. I will emphasize some of the same points that Roger made, but I think what I'm going to do then at the end is tell you what I see as the challenge for the Democratic Party going into this election cycle, which is primarily, will they want to unite, because I think they should want to, unite the left and center of the party, because I see a lot of folks on the left, especially younger Democrats who I talk to, want nothing to do with the center. I would argue it makes it hard to win an election, but we can discuss that. So first, I do want to say a few words about why the United States promoted and led this thing we now call the liberal international order, the rules-based order, why it went about doing that at the end of the Second World War, because a lot of people think it was about the Cold War. It was not about the Cold War initially. This was something that the founders, the framers, those who developed the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, and the other initial institutions were doing not because of the Soviet Union, but because of their experience over the previous 30 years. These were people who went through 2 world wars and a Great Depression. And they were determined not to have that again. And there were 2 factors that they believed led to the problems they had endured in the previous 30 years. Economic protectionism, we now look at as tariffs, and hypernationalism. And the goal was to try to set up a system that would mitigate those 2, that keep those 2 factors at bay. Other institutions came along, like NATO, and you know that were designed to fight the Cold War, but it was really about economic protectionism and hypernationalism, which is why the current president is such a threat, because he's the biggest champion of economic protectionism and hypernationalism. The very things that the order was designed to mitigate. Now, during the Cold War, the United States was, in John F. Kennedy's words, willing to bear any burden and pay any price to uphold the free world in the battle against the Soviet Union. And you fast forward to 1991, when the Soviet Union disappears, there were many Democrats and many Republicans who said, okay, we won, we did it. We don't need to play this role in the world anymore because our adversary has disappeared. And the folks who were in power, first in the George H.W. Bush administration and then in the Bill Clinton administration, really looked at the world from the standpoint of the lessons they drew from the 20th century, which was basically the United States withdrew from the world after World War I, and it gave us World War II. And the United States engaged after 1945, and it led to the victory of the Cold War and the position of the United States at the end of the Cold War. And so they were determined to keep those institutions going that had supported U.S. foreign policy during the Cold War. But you have a public that since 1991, it's not like this arose just suddenly in 2015. Since 1991, you have a public that's been increasingly disenchanted with the burdens that the United States has assumed in this global leadership. And of course, the belief that others, through this process, that others have taken advantage of the United States, as Roger mentioned, certainly animated the Trump campaign and the Trump foreign policy. No longer were we going to be suckers. We were not going to be taken advantage of. We were not going to be taken advantage of. So we are, we're now confronted once again with this question, should the United States lead and how should it do so? And the answer that Hillary Clinton would have provided would have been pretty similar to the basic contours of the 1991 to 2016 approach, which was all within whatever differences there were between the 2 Bushes and the 2 Clintons would have, and Obama, it was all within a pretty narrow band, as we now know, compared to what we have today. It's hard for me to see the Democrats going toward a Hillary Clinton type foreign policy. I just don't think that's where the Democratic Party is. Now, of course, the Trump answer to this is basically to go it alone. And look what he's done since he came into office. He exited the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He walked away from the JCPOA, the agreement on the Iran nuclear deal, which, to me was an enormous mistake. So if Roger feels differently, then maybe that's a point where we could have a debate.
Noted.
Good, excellent. The Paris Climate Accord, also again, walking away. In my view, which is, I think, just dovetails with Roger's, the why of U.S. leadership is the threat posed to democracy by China, by Russia, and by Iran. The how is trickier. And In part, I do think we can take advantage of some of what Trump has done. We do need our allies more than Trump seems to believe. So, post-Trump, which is really what we're talking about, because we're not going to get anything different over the next 2 years. Post-Trump, I think, a central starting point is to reinvigorate our alliances. But I would argue, really, it's not to fight a new Cold War. It's not to fight the old Cold War. It's not to fight a new Cold War with China. But it is to promote the idea that a world order based on democracy, markets, rule of law, and respect for human rights is better for us than the alternative. I think the issue is, and maybe we would have a debate here, I hope, is, well, we don't have, Roger, we don't have to do everything, so there I would think we agree. But the question is, can we find a way for the United States to lead without always being in charge? We have allies who are they're strong allies, they have a lot of capacity, they do have different views from us on certain issues, right? But if we're really going to empower the Canadians and the Japanese and the Germans and the French to do more, I think we need to accept that they may want to push forward on policies that we don't necessarily agree with. And historically, we had a hard time with that. We basically were, no, this is how we're going to do it. And I think what President Obama was trying to do, he got excoriated for this notion of leading from behind. But I think that did reflect this idea that he wanted to see the United States still in a leadership role, but not necessarily always in charge. And I do agree with that. I think that we do also need to recognize we can't do what we want to do in our foreign policy, and we can't support a foreign policy based on the notion of the importance of democracy if our own is as dysfunctional as it is. I mean, who the heck in the world is going to think, oh yeah, we want to look like them? When, 3 days before another potential shutdown, we're still in the, oh my God, are we going to have a shutdown or not? Oh, phew, we have a deal. This is no way to run a government. So a few words on the issue of Democrats and foreign policy. Because you have had a couple of the Democrats start to put out some foreign policy statements. Most of their discussion is going to center around issues like health care rather than on foreign policy. And typically in a presidential campaign, you'll get a debate. In the general election, you'll get one debate on foreign policy between the two candidates, but a lot of times foreign policy doesn't come up too much until then. As I said, I think the question really is, will the center and left come together? And I think that based on my conversations, that is going to be a challenge. I do think that even the center, which was more supportive of the use of force, particularly for humanitarian purposes in the Clinton years, Bill Clinton years, has, because of the experience in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya, come to be more restraint-oriented with respect to the use of force. I wouldn't say isolationist, but certainly more restraint-oriented. But the center still sees the need for a global U.S. presence, for U.S. leadership, and is supportive of free trade. And that, on the left, is a harder sell. You're not going to see the left of the Democratic Party stand up and tell you that the Trans-Pacific Partnership was a great deal. You're not going to see the left of the Democratic Party say NAFTA was a great deal. And I think they're wrong. I think NAFTA was a great deal, and I think the Trans-Pacific Partnership, working with 11 Asia-Pacific countries to promote greater free trade in the face of a rising China, was a great deal and was a huge mistake to walk away from. Just to introduce, one last comment, just to introduce a little potential subject for us to debate. You heard Roger's mention at the beginning what is a very conservative philosophy, which is the emphasis on sovereignty, American sovereignty. And he did also mention international institutions like the World Trade Organization. But I think, you know, on the Democratic side, the emphasis on sovereignty is not the be-all and end-all that it is on the conservative side. And I would particularly highlight that with respect to the issue of climate change, which you will hear a lot more from on the left than you will from the right. And I think the left is more open to international institutions, to other international arrangements that address the issue of climate change, even if that infringes on American sovereignty due to the threat that climate change poses. And I think there we should see a difference between Democrats and Republicans. The final thing I'd say, just because of Roger's point about, you know, critiquing on the isolationist or restraint side on the Republican Party, you know, one question is, you know, how much of a coalition can be built between the far left on the Democratic side and the far right on the Republican side. We saw this a little bit in the 1990s around trade issues, where you saw opposition to things like the World Trade Organization because of views for different reasons on the left and right. And whether or not we'll see that coming up today, I don't know. But I really do think for the Democrats, the real question is, will the progressive wing and the more centrist wing find common ground? And as I said at the outset, I am in, been talking to a number of people about this, and I don't know how it's going to end up, because I see, I'd be interested in your comments, I do see especially younger people on the Democratic side who consider themselves progressive to have no use for centrists like me. At least that's what I hear from them.
Okay, 5 minute response, 2 minutes, what do we need here?
Yeah, you've got 5 minutes.
Okay. So I'm just going to pick on some of the things that, worthy of debate. Hyper-nationalism and protectionism. Listen, I think Trump in his more extreme moments, or maybe call them Twitter moments, perhaps you can give him that grade and call him hyper-nationalist. Certainly the protectionism, there's an argument to be made that he's a pure protectionist and he's got a record for that. But actually, I want to argue that, the 3 areas that I outlined at the outset, security, prosperity, and freedom, I think he gets high marks on 1 and 2. And you could look at what he's done, particularly on trade. I said at the outset that Trump protectionism is not the way to go. But you could look at his behavior as a way of kicking the tires, really shaping the system to make sure that the free trade agreements that we have today, and the bilateral trade agreements, or in the case of NAFTA, or now the USMC, Trump is still pursuing free trade. He's just doing it to make sure that, quote unquote, we get a better deal out of it. I think the evidence for that is that we have USMC. Now, the cynical side will say, well, he was just, just needed to have his stamp of approval on it. You got to call it something different. It's the same system. But the reality is, Trump has taken that populist wave and by putting his stamp of approval on it, you've basically given Trump Republicans endorsement of or support of major free trade agreement. So that's good. So I think he's actually, in that respect, he's helped the cause of free trade, particularly for the demographic Jim was just talking about, because there's so many young people who think, or progressives, or people on the far right think, this is unfair trade and it's hurting us. I think what you're seeing come out of the Trump administration actually to date, now TPP is the exception, right? But whether you had Trump or Clinton, you weren't getting that agreement, right? But so I think NAFTA is far more instructive. On the area that I think I wish the president were better on is really being a voice to advance the cause of freedom. The manner in which he's engaged, Putin is just hard to kind of reconcile with kind of a Reagan-esque foreign policy. When it comes to Western democracies or autocrats, you would expect the embrace and the support to be on the side of Western democracies, and the president, I think, has fallen short there. But overall, on prosperity and security, even on the NATO side, this has been, on the whole, good. He hasn't left NATO. If he would have left NATO, I wouldn't be saying this. But the reality, he still remains in NATO, kept us in NATO, I should say, and I think NATO is better for it. We're getting more from our allies. That's important. Okay, I'll add 2 more points, really, to critique what's happening on not just on the far left, but on the center left too. This nomenclature of rebuild at home, this nomenclature of leave from behind, was cynical. Okay, it was done for electoral gain, and it came back ultimately to bite democratic centrists. The notion that somehow, we have to, Iraq and Afghanistan and the money and the lives somehow, was all regrettable, and we just need to focus on rebuilding home. That's a false choice, and the far left and the far right would have embraced that anyway. What we lost, I think, was a generation of people who could have supported those policies, but they were told by President Obama and his supporters that no, focusing on home to the exclusion of our obligations to interests abroad is okay. I think that was hugely harmful. Current administration is admittedly uneven on this point, but I think when you look at, and I'll wrap up with this, congressional Republicans' response to President Trump with respect to Syria policy or Afghanistan policy as recently as last week overwhelmingly rejected the type of policy that President Obama ran on, and President Trump, I think he listens to his to the Steve Miller side, not to the John Bolton side, would be guilty of doing as well. So I think Trump, for the most part, is not really with the mainstream of his party at this point.
All right, so this administration's trade policy is a disaster. I mean, it is a disaster. Imposing tariffs on our friends, going to the G7 meeting in Canada and treating our closest allies the way Trump has treated them, to get into a trade war with China without doing this together with our allies makes no sense whatsoever. He's right that China has taken advantage of us. He's right that we need to do something about that. But if you're going to do that, you want your allies with you. You don't want to have impose tariffs on your allies as you go into dealing with the trade war with China. And look at, for example, what that trade war has cost so many sectors of the American economy. Look at soybean farmers who have completely lost their export market to China, which China is replacing with exports from Brazil. Job losses in the Midwest. The notion that he's bringing jobs back through these tariffs is not the case. And when he tweets out about how many billions of dollars have poured into the U.S. Treasury thanks to his tariffs, China doesn't pay those. We pay them. It's a tax increase. And what's embarrassing to me is that Democrats aren't standing up to call him out on tax increases. And the fact is, I think they're not calling him out on tax increases because they're comfortable with protections. I think this is hugely a problem. Afghanistan, it's way past time for us to leave Afghanistan. And in fact, I would argue that the initial objective that we had in Afghanistan, which was to eliminate Afghanistan as a staging ground for Al-Qaeda to attack the United States, was an objective that was accomplished very early on. And we should have acknowledged that we had accomplished that early on, and then made clear that we didn't need to be there anymore unless we saw that organization reconstitute itself for future attacks on the United States. And I would just to end on the nationalism point, I do think this is a serious problem of this administration. I think it comes from the original sort of Trump's initial motive, feelings about these issues, plus whatever he learned from Steve Bannon. And I think the danger there is the way in which it pits us against our European allies. Because the EU is predicated on this effort to try to not see the nationalism bubble up the way it did in the first half of the 20th century. That's the whole reason for that project. And the United States has always supported that project until January 20th of 2017. And this is why the Europeans are talking about trying to find alternative arrangements in case they can no longer count on the United States, and why the President of the European Union has called the United States a foe and a threat, along with Russia, China, and Islamic extremism. This is purely a result of Trump policies.
I'm going to try and pry out a little bit more difference between the two of them by asking two questions. I'm going to give you a little bit more specific, too, about some issues. I think that there probably is a divide here on the extent to which you think U.S. military power should be the primary tool of foreign policy. And I suspect that there might also be a difference here on the extent to which you see China as the kind of threat you see China to be, and the U.S. approach toward that threat. So I would like to ask those two questions. How do you deal with a rising China, and to what extent does the United States need to increase its military capability and enhance its preeminence, so that there's a sense of the United States is losing its edge? Does it need to really reinvest to create that edge, or is that a more complicated situation in which the United States needs to use other kinds of power and maybe rely upon allies and look at it from more of a military sufficiency point of view? That'd be good with you.
Okay. Love those questions. That's good. Military power. So, to me, it kind of goes back to Reagan's notion that the way you maintain the peace is through overwhelming power. This administration's national security strategy seeks to make sure that the U.S. continues to be the preeminent military power in the world, because the assumption is that if we are preeminent, then the economic system, which we both agree we want to maintain, right, and our political system, and of course the security that we want to maintain, is pretty much guaranteed. The problem is, this kind of goes into your second question, is that we are losing pace with our adversaries. I put China as an adversary, particularly on the military line of effort, or side of things. The fact of the matter is that if we got into a hot fight with the Russians over, let's say, a Baltic state, over the Chinese, over their island building in the South China Sea, or the Senkaku Islands, off Japan, we would not be able to win, or if we did win, it would cost so much, both in treasure and lives, that the American people wouldn't be behind it. So we are no longer at the point in time where our strength is preeminent to the point where it's deterring the Chinese, where it's deterring the Russians and other adversaries. Now, that is all on the peace side of the ledger. We should invest, and I think we should invest robustly in our national defense to maintain the peace. How we use the military in terms of engaging in armed conflict and when, that's a separate question. I think certainly for security, check. For prosperity, check. Thomas Jefferson deployed our Navy to counter the barbary pirates. Right? This goes back a long way. The question is what you do when you deploy the military for things that the security nexus and the prosperity nexus aren't so kind of strong. That I think you have to be you use pretty much be far more restrained in the use of military power. But yeah, I do think that China is the pacing threat we face. I do view them as an adversary. That doesn't mean we have to be adversarial in terms of our political interaction or in our economic interaction. Although I will disagree with what was said before with respect to China and trade. Yeah, I wouldn't have picked tariffs on steel and aluminum. But I actually think President Trump and his administration was sound in punching China in the nose over trade and seeing what happened, making them bleed a little bit after they've exploited and taken advantage of us in so many ways. They just should have done it over trade secrets and technology and over steel and aluminum. So, President Trump's tactics with allies and China, I'm not going to defend that. No need here. I think they've hurt his cause more than anything else. But I do think that challenging China and actually being able to name China, what Republican and Democratic administrations have been unwilling to do, was long overdue, is 100% necessary, and we have a real security problem.
So I do want to just say just on that last point, I marvel at the way the president gets in his own way. I mean, even just toward the end of 2018, I mean, he had from the standpoint of how the United States economy was doing, like that should have been the only thing he was talking about. And yet, he went and shut down the government. It boggles the mind. So the role of military, so I would say if we should be able to have the military we need for $717 million. So if the point is we're not doing enough and we need to do more, then we need to reallocate some funds. Because $1,717 billion really should be more than enough for what the United States needs to do militarily. And I think the question is, what does the United States need to do militarily? And here, the China issue, this is the big issue. To me, Russia is not, Russia, is a challenge. We should be pushing back against Putin. He's doing things that are counter to our interests. They are not a major military threat. They're not going to be a major military threat. China is a threat, but it is not the threat the Soviet Union was. We could debate, we could argue about whether or not it could become that, 20, 30, 40 years from now. I really don't see it. I don't see them having that ambition. I think what they do want is to remove the U.S. presence from the Western Pacific. And I think Democrats and Republicans should unite around not allowing that to happen. But I don't think we really need to get ourselves into another Cold War situation. I don't think we have any interest in or need for a new nuclear arms race. And we had an excellent way of countering some of what China's doing by forging the 12-country Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I do think it is worth noting, since you mentioned it and I would just reinforce it, Hillary Clinton put herself in what I consider to be a terrible position by opposing that agreement. And, when I talk to friends who worked on the campaign, and they'd be like, oh yeah, but, when she comes in, she'll be for it. And I'd say, there's no way. You can't take that kind of a position in the campaign and then just say when you come in, oh yeah, I was just kidding. And I think that was incredibly irresponsible of her. I don't think it did anything for her really politically. I don't think it did anything for her politically. And I think that was an excellent way of putting a lot of pressure on China. And it was a huge own goal, which Trump seems to just have no limit to how many own goals he can score against the United States.
Another way to try and make some differences apparent would be to ask about humanitarian interventions. And you can take it from a 2019 hindsight, to look back at the post-Cold War era and how well we've done, or not, in answering this question. When should the United States use military force in another country for the protection of the people or for humanitarian purposes?
When we get to that, I just do think we should talk about follow with this defense budget line, because I would argue that $717 billion, because that's a big number, doesn't mean that answers the nail. We're a global superpower. We have to be dominant in multiple regions of the world. We divide it up. We're spending less in Asia than China. We're spending less in Europe than Russia, right? So there's another way to look at percent GDP. Otherwise, sorry. I just can't. That's what I can't avoid. But it's an important debating. It's an important point. I think a lot of people think about it, in my mind, using the wrong metric. So that's why I highlight it. Listen, humanitarian intervention. it's a tough nut to crack in terms of getting into the how you do it and kind of the way you go about it. But at the outset, I think process is hugely important when you deal with humanitarian intervention. I'll explain that in 1 second. And I think even if you have the right process, and here I'm talking about domestic authorities, international authorities, then particularly if you talk about use of military force, you better damn well know how you're getting out of it. And that's where we failed. We failed in Afghanistan, particularly in the humanitarian part with respect to that, although I disagree. I think we still should be in Afghanistan. I think there is a counterterrorism mission, and one that we're not nearly done with, and President Trump is risking so much by wanting to leave entirely. But when it comes to humanitarian intervention, you need to have a clear understanding in terms of what role the military will play. And unless it's executable and limited, you'll be there for decades. You'll never leave. And I think that's, frankly, where policymakers have failed us. Process. This is equally important. When it's a war of choice, not a war of necessity, or conflict of choice, not a conflict of necessity, meaning that we want to stop genocide, something along the lines, but it's not our people that are being impacted, congressional authorization, political branches need to agree. If you don't have agreement of political branches, don't do it in my book. It'll be just weak. It's kind of the Justice Jackson principle applied to humanitarian intervention. The second, have some sort of international authority, be it the UN or because China and Russia, will allow you to get through Security Council, at least through, some sort of alliance resolution. Libya was actually an interesting example of this. That's where I thought, the Obama administration failed in terms of how best to execute it, but got it right to be involved. I think the red line in Syria was a huge mistake by not engaging, because there was authority there, and the president should have stuck his neck out and gotten congressional authorization. Because he didn't get it, it didn't play out. And I think we're dealt with the Syria policy today in part because we didn't have the right process, and also, frankly, the military was able to kind of avoid it in a way that was only too convenient for President Obama. Happy to unpack all those points, but that's my quick answer.
So let me come back on two of them, and the most important, I think, is this first one about sort of military dominance in every region. And I, myself, increasingly question whether or not this is really necessary. And you're starting to see a term emerge among some Democrats on the notion of military sufficiency as opposed to military supremacy. And the supremacy thing has really been there since the end of the Cold War, and I think because of the U.S. position at the end of the Cold War, this notion that we would ensure that there was no rise of a peer competitor, that we would resist the rise of any kind of regional hegemon, adversarial hegemon, but then we would also resist the rise of any allied hegemon. At the time that this was being formulated in 1991-92, this was really in reference to Germany and Japan. I'm less and less convinced that we really need to maintain this. I think it's incredibly expensive. It's a large burden, and I'm not convinced we need it for our security, which was number one on Roger's list. And I do think we should really start to distinguish and think about the differences between what we need to do in Asia and what we need to do in Europe. I do think the President of the United States is correct that our allies in Europe need to do more. And they should really, given that I don't view Russia as a major military threat anymore, in my view, they should be able to manage that threat without us being dominant in Europe. I don't think that is the case in Asia, where I do think we need to continue to maintain our dominance and where we will work with our allies. But I do see that challenge as greater. And then, there's a huge question about the Middle East, where we have been involved, for decades, and there's a lot of hand-wringing about sort of the loss of American influence in the Middle East, and I think you've got sort of two core interests in the Middle East that have always been there: free flow of oil and support for Israel. And I think you get in trouble when you go too far beyond that. On interventions, to me, the most interesting question today is where would you come down on whether or not the intervention in Kosovo was correct? Because I think a lot of the other ones are pretty easy. First Gulf War, done brilliantly. 2003 Iraq War, oh my God. What a
humanitarian
what a huge blunder for American foreign policy. Kosovo to me is the interesting one because it was done for humanitarian purposes. We don't talk about it very much because it was a success, right? NATO, after 78 days, finally prevailed in the bombing campaign. Slobodan Milosevic, the leader of Serbia, who had caused the problems in the Balkans in the 90s, was out of power a year later. I've thought some about this because, in my view, I don't believe we would do a Kosovo today, 20 years later. I don't think the public support would be there for that intervention. And I'm not sure we should be doing interventions like that. I think the humility that's been in, we were pretty confident in 20 years ago, we were pretty confident. Bill Clinton went to Georgetown University in the fall of 1999 and said, we are now at the height of our power and prosperity. He didn't mean like we were at the peak and we were going to go down. That's the way it turned out. He meant we're at the height and we're continuing to go up. And that's not what happened. And Iraq and the financial crisis, self-induced by the United States, had a lot to do with that. But, we were there was a lot of hubris in 1999. And Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya have taken that hubris away. And so, there's been a lot written on how threatened the population, the Kosovo Albanians were at the time, because much of what threatened them occurred after the war started, not before. And I would actually distinguish between that and the threat that was posed to the population in Benghazi in 2011.
I have about 8 more questions, but we don't have that much time, so I'm going to actually open it up to you. Step up and introduce yourself. Let's see. Oh, wow, we've got lots of questions. Let's start at the back.
I'm an officer of this club. Somebody
Okay,
else.
then don't raise your hand. There you go.
I just want to say that I'm interested.
I have a question for Roger. So you talked about
Would you mind introduce yourself?
Oh, so,
Your
I'm
age
sorry.
here and all that?
I'm Michael. I'm a freshman here. I'm in SAS and SBA. So Roger, you mentioned about how we should look to Reagan's foreign policy and the A as an example for what we should do today. And if we look at the situation in the 1980s, the Soviet Union, while a big military power, was much economically weaker than the United States. So Reagan was in a large effect able to outspread the Soviet Union until it collapsed on itself. Obviously, there are other, internal domestic factors that played a big role. If you look at our main rival today, China's economy is surpassing us, and by some measures has surpassed. So, do you think that same model can work?
No, I think it's great question. I don't think that same, to me, history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. And I think the way it rhymes is in the sense that we have great power competition back, right? The competition is not the democratic power, right? Or power that shares our values. This is the Communist Party, right? But they've adopted aspects of Western economies and exploited it and really advanced their interest. And so, yeah, the imposing economic advantage, right, on the Soviet Union wouldn't apply to Chinese. I do think some things can be adopted, and we're really falling short. I think our comparative advantage is China. In the end, will be our political system. It will be our democratic system. The fact that people will choose freedom over following, the dictates of a communist party, and that's going to be relevant. I'm not even talking internally in China. I do think that there's things we should be doing to exploit that we're not. But as China looks to address its interests by exporting a system, whether in Asia or globally, that is going to be the best way we can combat what China's doing. And I've tried to lay out before why I think that's within our security interests and our economic interests, military interests, no doubt. Just quickly pivoting from that question to something that was raised just before, I'll simply say that military sufficiency, to me, is sufficient towards what? What are we trying to deter? What's required to deter? And if we do less or are satisfied with less, recognize that the void won't be filled by Western democracies. It's going to be filled by the Russias and the Chinas, and that's a risky outcome for us.
I think what we should do is take a couple of questions, and so that we make sure that people get in. Could you bring the mic up? And I'm going to come back to you, I promise.
Hi, my name is Mary Fitzgibbons. I have 3 comments / questions, and feel free to respond to whichever you see interesting or fit to your argument. My first is to you, and kind of just on your commentary about the shifting of the Democratic Party and kind of looking at young progressives and moderates. I am the granddaughter of proud conservative Republicans, the daughter of moderate Democrats, and I'm a progressive Democrat myself, so what a evolution that is. But
We had fun Thanksgiving.
very fun, very fun. But I think that what you were arguing about, the kind of shift in views of NAFTA and the TPP, I think honestly for young progressives, the main thing is the environment. And that is an area where we can really unite. And I think, I guess my commentary, and I'm interested to hear your response on this, is I think that moderate Democrats can really use the environment to unite the party and to find common ground within that area.
If you could do it in a form of a question and quickly, because we have a lot of people.
Yeah, I'll just say that as my one
Do you
question.
agree? The question is, do I agree?
Do you agree, and do you have any thoughts on that?
Okay.
Hello, my name is Darcy. I'm a sophomore here at American. I'm a mathematics major, but I wanted to come and listen. My question is related to the United States' ability to be a power in the world, but still help be able to take a back seat. And how do you believe, what steps should the United States take to accomplish that?
Can you go all the way back to the person that
Hi, my name is Lee Block. I am a junior here. So my question is this. As you know, today, the House voted to end U.S. funding to Saudi Arabia due to the crisis in Yemen. Congress cites the War Powers Resolution, giving it precedent to do this. The White House says that's unconstitutional. Who's right and why?
Okay, I think 3 is enough for now. Jim, start with you.
All right, you're going to take a Congress question? That's her bread and butter. Yeah, climate change, I do think that we are seeing a recognition on the Democratic side of climate change as the existential threat of our time. And it's interesting, right? Because you have one of the most left members of the House putting forward a Green New Deal, and the Republicans, at least the Senate Majority Leader, believing he can embarrass the Democrats by forcing them to vote on the Green New Deal. I think we'll see. I don't think it's an embarrassment to vote on the Green New Deal. So, I mean, whether that's I haven't read it, so but from what I read about it, there should be something that the Democrats put forward like that Democrats can unite around. And I think Democrats should be able to take advantage of Republican denials of science. So that, I'd say that on that. On your question, this gets to Roger's, why will the void be filled by our allies, by our adversaries if we do less? Why won't our allies fill the void? I think we should have more confidence in our allies. We should do more to support our allies wanting to fill the void. Are they way away from being able to do that? Yeah, they're really way away. Should the Germans be able to do more? Yeah, they really should. Will they? Not clear. And thus, will he be right? That would be really unfortunate. But I'm not willing to concede that yet. I will just say one thing on Congress.
And everything's unfortunate.
Congress has enormous authority in foreign policy given to it by the Constitution of the United States, which it has looked to abdicate for decades on both use of force questions and trade issues. And it really would be about time for Congress to reclaim the powers that were given to it.
I'll be quick on the environment. You know, it's focused there, but it's a great opportunity for Republicans. I really actually do think if the Green New Deal is what the Democrats are going to embrace, there's a huge space for Republicans to come in and do something really pragmatic, pro-business, pro-environment, and you know, it won't be under this administration, but I think it's a huge opportunity going out. U.S. power and leadership backseat. To me, it's not a question of front seat or back seat. It's about interests. It's just about interests. Where our interests reside, according to the principles I put forward, we should be in the front seat because we never want to let somebody else take care of our interests when it comes to security and prosperity. Why wouldn't we outsource that? I think I'd be irresponsible and reckless. But other things that aren't our business, keep our nose out of it. I think that's a lot of what you see from Trump administration folks. For the most part, I think some of the places where they say we should keep our nose out of ultimately are places that really are within our interests. Freedom, democracy, arena being a prime example. Congress. I worked on the AUMF and modifying it to address, give it an update. And that was my first encounter with the Tea Party. That was fun. But I'll simply say that, listen, it's politics, people. Congress reflects electoral reality. Right? As long as members of Congress are elected, right, and want to be reelected, and that's maybe the part we can debate, as long as they want to be reelected, they're only going to take votes that their electorate wants them to take. And when it comes to foreign policy, the past 3 decades, it hasn't been within their electoral interest to oppose the President of the United States or to oppose the executive branch. What you're seeing on Yemen is because, wow, we finally recognize that my people, my electorate, don't want us to do that. They don't want to be supporting the Saudis. They don't want. They get on the wrong side of this conflict in Yemen, or the administration has mishandled it so supremely that they want to get out of it. But it's politics. That's what the Congress is about. That's what the Article 1 is fundamentally about.
Other questions?
I think you probably could take that one, but you're not debating it. I offended you with the congressional piece over there. I was saying it's not about politics.
Okay, yeah. Hi, my name is Will Scott. I'm a freshman. I'm an SPA, and full disclosure, I'm a conservative Republican.
Welcome to the dark side. It's not terrible. Reagan was.
We have Reagan. But regardless, my question is a little bit of a devil's advocate question here. And it's sort of on the role of alliances. Both of you have sort of embraced this, at least a sort of similar position on alliances where you say that we need to continue to support alliances, particularly NATO, but you've also said, both of you, that the allies need to do more. So my question is essentially this. Throughout history, it seems the United States has formed alliances when it's mutually beneficial to both parties. For example, in the Revolutionary War, we allied ourselves with France because France was really the only military power that could realistically stand up and hold its own against Britain in the Revolutionary War, and France wanted to fight the British. A more recent example would be the U.S. teaming up with the Soviet Union in World War II because, I mean, we were both fighting the Nazis. Soviets had a lot of manpower. It made sense to attack them from 2 fronts. But I think to a lot of people, it seems that in recent decades especially, our alliances are less about, especially NATO, is less about being mutually beneficial and more about other countries sort of outsourcing their defense needs to the United States at the expense of the American taxpayer. An example of that would be the fact that every NATO member has agreed to a 2% of its GDP spending thresholds on military spending, and yet very few of the NATO member states have surpassed that threshold. Just finishing up here, it also seems like a lot of the public opinion in especially Western Europe has turned in the last few decades to be very anti-American in sentiment. That's debatable, but so I guess my question for you is, why should the United States continue to support these alliances that seem like they're not mutually beneficial?
Hi, I'm a freshman, so you'll have to pardon me if I don't know like words very well. My question is, there's been a huge focus on the military this talk, which fair, the military is important, but I think one of the big parts of diplomacy and being a world leader is soft power. And I see China investing in pearls, or the string of pearls, and I put the word for it, but all the investment they're doing in roads across Eurasia belt, and just investment in Africa. And that's just, it seems to me like we're losing soft power compared to the amount. I'm just curious why that's in a focus and what you guys think about that.
It's a great question.
Great words.
Great words.
Hi, my name is Jake. I'm a sophomore at SIS, and I'm a progressive Democrat. I think you could best, put me in a box if we're going to do that like that. However, in terms of foreign policy, I think people like Marco Rubio and the late great John McCain sort of represent my foreign policy views on the best. I do believe in a lot of those principles. That's why I shouted out freedom at the beginning of the talk. But I do think that part of the reason why a lot of people of my generation and people who are increasingly moving toward the left feel sort of adversely to American power, to being more involved internationally, is because in the past 10 years we've lived through the war on terror, we've seen the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan grow sour. So I'm just wondering what's your take on that? And in addition, and you talked about those three values. I guess my question for both of you would be: when do we have to compromise freedom? When do we have to compromise on security? And when do we have to compromise prosperity? All right, thanks, guys.
Great question. Let's start with those three, and then you'll get the last word.
All right.
Jim, you want to?
So let's start with the last one, and I'm assuming we would agree on this. We should have a lot of optimism about the United States. And, when we do look at our major adversaries, they face enormous challenges. And the biggest thing if you look at the countries that are most threatening to our interests, China, Russia, and the authoritarian regimes, the thing that none of them has figured out how to do is political succession. And it creates enormous challenges, legitimacy challenges, and the threat of instability. Right? What's going to happen when Putin's term ends in 2024? Nobody knows. Right? Although people worry about a 2020 election in which Trump loses and doesn't vacate the premises, I really think that's a pretty low probability. And so this is an enormous, our system is an enormous advantage, but we really do need to get back to a point where we can actually have whatever disagreements there are in both parties, that we're not shutting down the darn government and we are trying to address the problems that affect citizens. We do need to invest in diplomacy. Again, we still have a lot of soft power, right? But you do have to invest in things. For example, a big part of our soft power is we still do have the greatest universities in the world, but other countries are improving their universities. And their universities are becoming more attractive to people outside the United States who are afraid or can't come to the United States. That was always an enormous advantage on the part of the United States. We do have to invest, investing in the State Department. I think this is something that has bipartisan support on Capitol Hill when Tillerson, in the first year, talked about a huge cut to the State Department budget. The Hill was going to have none of it. The last on our alliances and the rationale for alliances, and again, I think here while we both support alliances, I'm much more willing to try to, or eager to move to a world where our allies are doing more in the sense that we're not always driving the train. I have a lot of faith and confidence in our allies. They have strong political systems, democratic political systems, strong sharing of our values. and this also gets back to the earlier question about China. You know, yes, China has had rapid economic growth, but when you combine the US, Japan, South Korea, Canada, and our democratic allies, we dwarf anything that the rest of the world can do. And so we need to create the sense that we are, in fact, an alliance of democracy, of market democracies, and be able to deal with the rest of the world from that perspective.
So, follow. I agree with much of that. I think that the NATO piece, yeah, it's a great question. Like, what are we getting out of it? And part of it's, you know, lessons of history. If you leave European security to the Europeans, that looks like World War I and World War II. Hard thing to argue to, you know, millennials or people that, you know, weren't alive during, you know, 9/11, let alone, you know, think about World War II. But that's the lesson. And then it's the last point was made, which I completely agree with. You know, two areas that we have comparative advantage dealing with a Russia or a China, right? The first is our system of government, right? This is freedom element we were talking about before. I stand by that. The second is our alliances. We have more friends, okay? Look what happened in Afghanistan. Afghanistan, a lot of mistakes. But after 9/11, what was the one time that NATO issued Article 5 of the treaty, which means collective defense? It was at 9/11 in Afghanistan. Show me the proximity between Afghanistan and Europe. No, that's what friends do. Huge, big deal. And I worked in the Department of Defense, I saw how NATO allies, large and small, were contributing to that. It pays to have friends. Now, like I made a point before, I don't have such a huge issue with Trump's tactics I have issues with. But challenging and fighting with friends and disagreeing, that's what real relationships are. And frankly, Bush administration, Obama administration, papered over that stuff, and it's a mistake. Active live friendships are important, and there are going to be disagreements there. Soft power, you know, I think it's an important point, and one that we should emphasize. I think Ted is a little bit lazy thinking around it. So again, I'm on my national security specialty. I focus on the military, so it could be I'm just not expert enough on soft power. But I think for the most part, it's a throwaway line. I don't think we really developed that stuff enough. I saw it in Afghanistan, it was pathetic what development diplomacy was, and the apparatus just is, it seems to be a lot of paper pushing and not enough creative thinking. I do think, though, we're advantaged in China because China is exploiting populations in Africa, and that's just not our system. And so ultimately we'll win out of that. Last point, the one that I really kind of struggle with is this kind of adverse to American power because of Afghanistan and Iraq. We've lost the trust of American people. Right? That's the essence of it. We just have to accept that in terms of how we deploy American power. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we can't regain that trust. I think leadership, both President Trump and President Obama, have done more to erode that trust than restore it. That's a huge problem. I'd love to see whoever the next president is work on the restoration, not completely, you know, add to the erosion because of political expedience.
So we're near the end of the time, so if you could be quick, you get the last word.
So you've mentioned...
I need a name, age, background.
I'm Stefan. I am a sophomore here at AU. I would consider myself a pragmatic liberal Democrat. And here's my question. So we've talked, you mentioned briefly the backlash to TPP, largely on environmental and labor standards. How do we sell, whether it be major trade deals like NAFTA, CAFTA, TPP, and others, and other forms of soft power to the American people, despite the fact that they might have price tags or cause economic dislocation?
You're gonna make me go first. Oh. Yeah, I know. I mean, it's a great question. It's a really important question. Actually, I think it's easier to make the case now when people see the devastation that tariffs can wreak on the American economy. So I think that the nightmare of economic protectionism is a great way to sell the need for free trade. And I think actually, you know, I don't give Trump credit for much. And that includes the new NAFTA with its new name.
United States Marine Corps.
But the, yeah, but the, you know, the new provision in terms of on wages in order to try to ensure that American workers would not be disadvantaged by lower wages in Mexico. And the ability to use trade agreements in order to, so that you don't have basically our companies fleeing to low-wage markets, but in order to actually try to bring wages up, or at least, you know, have provisions so that our higher wage workers aren't disadvantaged, I actually think is something that I hope will become a model for thinking about these agreements going forward, because I do think that was not a priority previously, and I think that, you know, that cost the support of people in the parts of the country where, you know, they were really hammered by some of these.
Here's my quick take. You know, Walmart and Costco, I don't know, wherever you end up in that spectrum or some other place, you're not going to want to pay more for your goods. The less trade agreements we have, the more they're going to cost us, right? That's the pain. I hope, and then if you're a soybean farmer or somebody else, and I simply can't sell my product anymore overseas, you're also going to feel that pain. So it's kind of the hard lesson that you're describing. What I hope is that, you know, Trump's kind of putting his toe in a little bit of tariff land will be enough kind of to burn some folks that they'll say, hey, we're better off with free trade. It's the same way that I don't want to justify defense budgets on the basis of, you know, having to go through World War II or World War III, right? You want to be able to justify policies without having to go through kind of trauma. And you know, I'm thinking, again, this is, the tactics have been great, but challenging China and trade, maybe not the allies, but China and trade as a whole, I think will reinforce, I think on the public side it certainly has, basically an approach to free trade agreements going forward.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody, for coming, and of course to our co-sponsors, the College Republicans and College Democrats, for helping us out with this event. But thank you most of all to our speakers here, our guests for the night. Another round of applause, please, for them.
Did a great job. Should get her book on Mission Creek.
Somebody's gonna keep it.